Grandma here, and I'm reading chapter 7, Hamid Completes His Mission. And we have a picture of him going through a door, a silhouette. Well, they have been, somewhat fortunate that on the whole, their trip to the Friday market has not been too bad. 24 hours later, Hamid found himself gazing up at the walls of the city he'd come so far to find, feeling more strange and lost than he ever felt before in his life. He had had a very successful day. He had woken at dawn, cool and refreshed. The woman had fed them and blessed them and sent them out with her husband. At the bottom of the hill, a truck, jammed tight with market goers, had picked them up and rattled off down the valley. Hamid had never been in a truck before, and the noise and speed and jolting thrilled him. The main road thrilled him too, with its roaring traffic, and the 2 hours drive passed all too quickly. The road turned off to Wednesday Market, and he and Kinza were dropped about 25 kilometers from their destination. He had walked all day, patiently plodding along in the heat, often sitting down to rest. At one point, he decided to stop and wash out Kinza's little dress in the river, since he thought that nobody was going to be really pleased to see her unless she was a little bit cleaner. When she was redressed, he decided she looked fit for a palace. He climbed a long, long hill, stopping to pick wildflowers along the way for Kinza to present to her new mother. At last, he rounded a bend in the road, and just ahead of him was the old city wall and the town inside, in the shadow of the bare, jagged mountains. Hamid stood in the cool of the shadow of the gate and watched for a while. He did not think he would have to ask the way if he could find the market, for his mother had described the house exactly, and he was afraid to speak to anyone. He thought he would wait until nighttime before making his way along those narrow, crowded, cobbled streets. It would be easier to slip along in the dark. But as dusk deepened, he saw the shopkeepers on each side of the streets turn on the lights, and everyone walked past in full glare of them. Apparently, in this terrifying place, there was no darkness and no hiding. The sooner he could safely get Kinza settled, the better. He set off timidly along the cobbles, marveling at the beautiful things displayed in the shops, the bright silks and piles of fruit and stacks of bread. It seemed to him like a fairyland, and he gazed bright-eyed and fascinated at all this beauty, a magic town where everything glittered and dazzled. He forgot that he had felt lonely and afraid, and gazed up eagerly into the faces of the shopkeepers and passers-by. But no one smiled at him or looked kindly at him, and no one welcomed him to the Golden City. He crept along until he came to a splashing fountain where a little girl was filling buckets. She at least looked like a kind little girl, and very shyly he asked her the way to the inn above the market. She pointed him in the right direction. It was not far. The old archway leading into the inn courtyard stood back from the street. Weary mules and donkeys were passing in, and travelers stood in groups looking out on the market. Hamid longed to go and rest on the straw with the donkeys, but he had no coin to pay for such shelter, and anyway, he felt his business had better be done that night. He thought the house of the nurse would not be difficult to find, and he set off confidently. The street curved, and he stopped. He could see the inn now, and the rubbish tip beyond, and what he saw filled him with surprise. There was a dim streetlight outside the last house on the left, and under it he could see a group of little boys, dirty and ragged like himself, standing as if they were waiting for something to happen. As Hamid watched, the door was opened from the inside, and a beam of bright light shone out into the cobbles. The children surged forward, tumbling over each other, and disappeared through the golden doorway. Then he heard other footsteps behind him, and 3 more little boys in black tatters rushed past him on swift bare feet. They too went in. Then as Hamid stood still in the shadows, He heard the sound of singing, and he thought he'd never heard anything so beautiful. Lured by the music, he crept closer, skulking along the wall, and at last he reached the top of the step and dared to peep in. Then he gasped with joy and excitement, for he was looking across a passageway into another room, and hanging on the wall of that room, exactly opposite the doorway, was the picture of the man who loved little children, carrying in his arm a curly-haired babe just about Kinza's age. Boys and girls were crowding around him, holding out their arms, and he smiled down on them and did not seem to want them to go away. Hamid remembered the stern, hard faces of the shopkeepers. This man was unlike any of them. He would certainly welcome Kinza just as he had welcomed the crowd of happy children in the picture. But who were all these ragged little boys? And why did they go in? And what were they singing about? He could not see them, for they all gathered at one end of the room, but he could hear a woman's voice. As he listened, crouching on the step, straining to catch the words, the children began to chant something all together, as though they were learning it by heart, just as they did in the mosque schools when they learned the Quran. Jesus said, "I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but have the light of life." John 8:12. What could that mean? 3 times they repeated the verse, and Hamid whispered the words with them and tucked them away in his memory to think about afterward. The immediate problem now was what to do about Kinza. If all these children belonged to the nurse, she would certainly not want another. No little girls had gone into the house, so perhaps the English, like his own people, on the whole, preferred boys. Kinza's chances seemed very small. If he knocked on the door and presented her as a gift, he must think of a better way than that. Then he thought of a plan that he was certain would work, because his mother had said that the saint in the picture had never been known to turn a child away. He would simply leave Kinza in the passage, like a surprise parcel, to explain herself as best she could. If this nurse was really like her saint, she would not throw such a tiny, helpless, homeless creature into the street on a dark night. He skipped across the orange beam of light and sat down on the rubbish heap. He shook Kinza until she was thoroughly awake, and then spoke to her solemnly. "Kinza, little sister," he said, "I'm going to sit you down by yourself, and you must keep very still and not cry. If you cry, a lady will beat you hard. If you don't cry, she will soon come and give you a nice sweet." Now, Kinza understood this perfectly. She knew all about being hit if she did not keep still, and she seldom got what she wanted by crying. Also, she was very hungry. So she let Hamid soothe and pat her, and then placed the withering bunch of flowers in her hand. He crept off the rubbish heap. He pushed the door open a little way, lifted Kinza over the step, and sat her down in the dark passage. Hamid suddenly felt his throat tighten and his eyes fill with tears. Kinza would never be his own again, and he realized how much he loved her. As a sign of his love, he took out his last dry crust from the cloth and thrust it into her hand. Then he left her sitting cross-legged against the wall, very tousled, very crumpled, clasping a bunch of dead poppies and an old crust for the surprise and delight of the missionary lady. But through the blur of his tears, he caught sight once again of the face of the man in the picture, and he seemed to be smiling straight at Kinza. Hamid felt comforted. Then, crouching against the wall of a little alley leading off the street, he tried to remember the words he had heard 3 times over. Jesus said, "I am the light of the world. Instead of darkness, you shall have the light of life." It was something like that, and whatever could it mean? What was the light of the world? He thought of the lamp burning in his hut at home and the flickering shadows on the wall. He remembered the moonlit journey and the circling stars and the sunrise on top of the mountain. Moonlight, starlight, sunlight, candlelight, and the orange glare of the city street. They had all faded now. He was sitting alone in a very dark alley, and the moon had not yet risen behind the wall of rock. But Jesus said that instead of darkness, you can have the light of life. I am the light of the world. He thought of Kinza, always living in darkness. Could this light, which he had never seen, ever reach her? What did it all mean? If only it weren't so dark, if only he weren't so hungry, if only he could have kept Kinza, if only he could run home to his mother. He stopped short in his thoughts and leaned forward eagerly. A crowd of boys came hurrying down the street, and at the corner they turned and waved. They were talking excitedly, all at once, so Hamid could not hear very well what they said, but he caught odd words. Who is she? Such a little girl. Where is her mother? Then the boys passed out of sight, and the street was left in silence. Then, because he was longing to know what had happened, he tiptoed out of his alley and prowled back to the rubbish heap. The door through which he had placed Kinza was fast shut, and no sound came from inside. What had happened? There was a light in the upper window, and Hamid crossed the street and stood with his back pressed against the wall of the house opposite, gazing upward. As he stood there looking, there passed across the lighted window the figure of a woman, nestling a little child in her arms, and the child showed no signs of fear. She neither struggled nor cried. She lay at peace with one little hand uplifted to feel the face bowed over her. Hamid had successfully completed his mission. All was well with Kinza. Not knowing where else to go, he slunk back to the rubbish heap, and covering himself as best as he could with his rags, he curled up against his wall to sleep, and his head resting on his arm. Well, it's nice to know that Kinza's being taken care of, but we are not halfway through the book. So I think Kinza has a lot of adventures yet to go through, or Hamid does. Maybe both of them do. The next chapter, I'm not going to read right now, I'll read it the next time, is called Donuts and Street Boys. And here we have a picture of what I think are donuts from their country. They don't look very much like our donuts, other than they're round and they seem to have a hole in the center. But I think that, can you guess what you think that chapter is going to be about? I think it means that Hamid is going to join all that band of boys, and perhaps sometimes go to the mission and sing the songs, learn about the kind man with the children around him. Anyway, we'll see next time. Bye-bye.